I stared at my phone screen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. There he was. Jareth, my sister's husband, the man who should have been sitting beside Maribel's hospital bed, holding her hand while machines kept her alive. Instead, he was on a yacht, laughing, drinking champagne, his arm wrapped around some blonde woman in a red bikini. The timestamp on the Instagram story read just 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes while my sister lay unconscious in the ICU after a car accident that nearly killed her. I screenshot the image, my finger trembling over the save button. What I was about to do would destroy everything, but what he had already done was so much worse. Before I begin this story, can you tell me where in the world you're listening to from? The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I kept staring at my alarm clock, willing it to be a nightmare. Maribel had been in a head-on collision on Highway 52 just 15 minutes from her perfect suburban home. The drunk driver walked away without a scratch. My sister was airlifted to St. Mary's with internal bleeding, a shattered pelvis, and a traumatic brain injury that had the doctors using words like touch and go and prepare for the worst. I threw on yesterday's clothes and drove through empty streets to the hospital, my heart hammering against my ribs. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant and desperation. Families clustered in plastic chairs, some crying, others staring at nothing with that hollow look that comes when your world tilts sideways in a single phone call. I found my parents, Lowell and Neoma, in the surgical waiting area. Dad's work shirt was buttoned wrong. Mom's mascara had left black tracks down her cheeks. They looked like they had aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. "Where's Jareth?" I asked, scanning the waiting room for my brother-in-law's tall frame and perfectly styled hair. Mom shrugged, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that had disintegrated into wet fragments. "He said he had to handle some things at home first. Insurance paperwork, you know. He'll be here soon." But something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced either. Jareth was the type of man who thrived on being seen as the hero, the devoted husband, the guy who had everything under control. His absence felt wrong, like a missing puzzle piece that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. 3 hours passed before Jareth finally arrived, and when he did, he looked immaculate. His khaki slacks were pressed. His polo shirt was spotless. His hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. He hugged my parents with just the right amount of emotion, his voice cracking in all the appropriate places as he asked about Maribel's condition. But when he hugged me, I caught something else entirely. The faint smell of expensive cologne mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. Salt air, maybe. Or sunscreen. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it nagged at me like a splinter you can feel but can't quite find. Doc Oswin emerged from surgery just after noon, his scrubs stained and his face grave. Maribel was alive, but barely. The next 48 hours would be critical. They had managed to stop the internal bleeding, but the brain injury was severe. She was in a medically induced coma to reduce swelling, and there was no way to know how much damage had been done until she woke up. If she woke up, we took turns sitting beside her bed, talking to her unconscious form, willing her to squeeze our hands or flutter her eyelids or give us any sign that she was still fighting. Jareth played his part perfectly during visiting hours. He held Maribel's hand and whispered sweet things in her ear about how much he loved her and needed her to come back to him. He brought her favorite flowers every day, even though she couldn't see them. He charmed the nurses with his concern and his questions about her care. To everyone watching, he was the devoted husband facing every spouse's worst nightmare. But I started noticing things. Small things, like how he always seemed to have somewhere important to be just as visiting hours ended. Or how his phone was constantly buzzing with messages that made him step into the hallway to respond privately. On the third day, while Jareth was having one of his mysterious hallway conversations, I decided to do something I had never done before. I followed him. He walked quickly through the hospital corridors, past the gift shop and the cafeteria, until he reached the parking garage. His voice echoed off the concrete walls, low and urgent. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught fragments. "Not now," he was saying. "It's complicated." And then, clearer than anything else, "Just give me a few more days to figure this out, Trina. Please." Trina. I had never heard Maribel mention anyone named Trina. When Jareth returned to the ICU, I was back in my chair beside Maribel's bed pretending to read a magazine. He seemed flustered, running his hand through his hair in a way that messed up his usual perfect styling. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. He nodded quickly, too quickly. "Just work stuff. You know how it is. Real estate doesn't stop for anything." But Maribel had always complained that Jareth's real estate business was slow. She had been talking about going back to work full-time to help with their finances. So what urgent real estate business could he possibly have that couldn't wait while his wife fought for her life? That night, after my parents had gone home to get some rest and Jareth had left for another one of his mysterious errands, I sat alone with Maribel in the sterile quiet of the ICU. The machines beeped steadily, monitoring her heartbeat, her breathing, her brain activity. I held her hand, feeling how small and fragile it seemed compared to the strong, capable hands that used to braid my hair when we were kids. "I don't know what's going on, Mar," I whispered to her still form. "But something isn't right with Jareth, and I'm going to find out what it is." As if in response, one of her monitors beeped slightly faster for a moment before returning to its steady rhythm. I chose to believe she had heard me. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source: Jareth's own arrogance. On day 5 of Maribel's coma, he left his phone unattended on the visitor chair while he went to get coffee. It buzzed with a text message, and the preview was visible on the lock screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight. The yacht is all ready. Trina." My blood turned to ice in my veins. While my sister lay unconscious, fighting for her life, her husband was planning romantic evenings on a yacht with another woman. I quickly grabbed my own phone and took a picture of his screen before he returned. My hands were shaking so badly I had to take 3 photos to get a clear one. When Jareth came back with his coffee, I was sitting exactly where he had left me, reading the same magazine page I had been staring at without seeing for the past 20 minutes. He picked up his phone, glanced at the screen, and I watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He deleted the message and slipped the phone into his pocket, but the damage was done. I had seen enough. That evening, I told my parents I needed to go home to shower and change clothes. Instead, I drove to Marina Bay, the only yacht club within driving distance of the hospital. It was an exclusive place where the local wealthy kept their boats, the kind of establishment that catered to people like Jareth who enjoyed the finer things in life even when they couldn't quite afford them. I parked in the visitor lot and walked along the docks, scanning the boats for any sign of him. The sun was setting, casting everything in golden light, and couples were dining on deck chairs while the water lapped gently against their hulls. I found him on a 40-foot yacht called Second Chance, which felt like the universe's idea of a cruel joke. He was with a woman I had never seen before, tall and blonde with the kind of artificial perfection that comes from expensive procedures and unlimited leisure time. They were drinking champagne and feeding each other strawberries like characters in a romantic movie. The woman was wearing a red bikini despite the cooling evening air, and Jareth had his arm around her waist possessively. They were laughing at something on his phone, probably some inside joke between lovers who thought their secret was safe. I stood behind a piling far enough away that they couldn't see me but close enough to hear their conversation. The woman, who I now knew must be Trina, was talking about vacation plans. "When this is all over," she was saying, "we should take the yacht to the Bahamas. Just you and me, and the open water." Jareth nodded, refilling her champagne glass. "Soon," he promised. "Just need to get through this rough patch and we'll have everything we want." His voice was different than it was at the hospital, looser, more genuine. This was the real Jareth, not the performance he put on for grieving family members. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The video was shaky at first because my hands were trembling with rage, but I steadied myself and captured several minutes of their intimate evening together. Jareth kissing Trina's neck, Trina running her fingers through his hair, the two of them toasting to new beginnings while my sister lay in a coma 15 miles away. At one point, Trina asked if he felt guilty, and Jareth actually laughed. "She'll never know," he said, "and even if she did, what's she going to do? Leave me? She needs me too much." The casual cruelty in his voice made me physically sick. I drove back to the hospital with my mind racing. Part of me wanted to march into the ICU and confront him immediately, to scream at him in front of the nurses and my parents and anyone else who would listen. But I knew that wouldn't accomplish anything except making me look like the hysterical sister who was looking for someone to blame for Maribel's accident. I needed to be smarter than that. I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. So I spent the next 2 days documenting everything, Every mysterious phone call, every time he left early, every excuse that didn't quite make sense. On the seventh day, while Jareth was at one of his work meetings, I did something I never thought I would do. I broke into his house. Marable had given me a spare key years ago for emergencies, and this definitely qualified. Their home was a testament to Jareth's need to appear successful. Expensive furniture they couldn't afford, artwork that was more about status than beauty, a kitchen that belonged in a magazine but rarely saw actual cooking. It was the kind of place that looked perfect on social media but felt cold and empty in person. I found what I was looking for in Jareth's home office, tucked inside a folder labeled Business Expenses. Bank statements showing payments to the yacht club, credit card receipts for expensive dinners and jewelry that I was certain Marable had never received, hotel charges on nights when he claimed to be working late at the office. And most damning of all, a printout of an insurance policy on Marable's life that had been significantly increased just 3 months ago. The beneficiary was listed as Jareth, and the payout was substantial enough to solve all his financial problems and fund whatever new life he was planning with Trina. My sister's phone buzzed from her purse, which had been returned to the family along with her other personal effects from the accident. I saw Jareth's name on the screen with a text that made my blood boil. "Thinking of you, baby. Get better soon so we can start our real life together. I love you so much. Your devoted husband." Below that was another message thread I had never seen, one that Marable had apparently hidden from everyone. It was from 3 weeks ago, and it was her writing to Jareth. "I know about Trina. We need to talk when I get home from Mom's tonight." The timestamp showed it was sent just 2 hours before her accident. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. Marable had discovered the affair and confronted him. That night she was driving home from our parents' house, probably planning to demand answers or maybe to leave him entirely. The accident might have been random bad luck, but Jareth's behavior afterward was calculated and cold. He was using her condition as an opportunity to play the grieving husband while continuing his affair, probably hoping she would never wake up to expose him, and if she did recover, he would have done enough damage control to convince everyone that I was the one with problems, the jealous sister who couldn't accept her siblings' happiness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot until dawn, staring at the evidence I had gathered and trying to decide what to do with it. Part of me wanted to call the police, but I wasn't sure they could do anything with what I had. Adultery isn't illegal, and while Jareth's behavior was morally reprehensible, proving that he had somehow caused or contributed to Marable's accident would be nearly impossible. I needed something more direct, more immediate, more devastating to his carefully constructed facade. The opportunity came the next morning when Dr. Oswin gathered our family in the consultation room. Marable's brain swelling had decreased significantly, and they were going to start reducing her sedation to see if she would regain consciousness. It was the moment we had all been praying for, the first real sign of hope we had received in over a week. My parents were crying with relief. Jareth was saying all the right things about how grateful he was and how much he loved his wife, but I could see the worry in his eyes, the fear of what Marable might remember when she woke up. "There's something you all need to know," I said suddenly, interrupting Jareth's performance. "About what's been happening while Marable has been unconscious." The room went quiet. Dr. Oswin looked uncomfortable, probably wishing he could escape back to the safety of medical procedures and test results. My parents stared at me with confusion and growing alarm. Jareth's face went very still, like he was bracing for impact. I pulled out my phone and opened the video I had recorded at the marina. This was taken 3 nights ago, while we were all supposed to be focused on Marable's recovery. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face went through several different shades of red before settling on a color that suggested he was having trouble processing what he was seeing. My mother made a small, wounded sound like an animal caught in a trap. Jareth opened his mouth to speak, probably to spin some explanation about how the video was out of context or doctored or didn't mean what it clearly meant. But before he could say anything, my mother stepped forward and slapped him across the face with a crack that echoed through the consultation room. "Get out," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Get out of this hospital and don't you dare come near my daughter again." Jareth's hand went to his cheek, his eyes wide with shock. He wasn't used to consequences. He had spent so long manipulating situations and people that he had forgotten what happened when someone called him on his behavior. "You don't understand," he started to say, but my father cut him off. "We understand perfectly," Dad said, standing up to his full height. At 63, my father was still an intimidating man when he was angry. The question is whether Maribel will understand when she wakes up, or if we need to help her understand. I showed them the insurance policy documents and the text messages from Maribel's phone. Watching my parents' faces as they realized that their daughter had discovered her husband's betrayal just hours before her near-fatal accident was one of the hardest things I had ever witnessed. The implications hung in the air like smoke, toxic and choking. None of us wanted to say out loud what we were all thinking, but it didn't need to be said. Jareth had motive, opportunity, and a complete lack of moral compass. Whether he had actually caused the accident or simply taken advantage of it, he was guilty of something unforgivable. 2 hours later, Maribel opened her eyes for the first time in 8 days. It was a moment that should have been purely joyful, a miracle that our family would celebrate for the rest of our lives. Instead, it was complicated by the knowledge of what she would have to face when she was strong enough to hear the truth. Her first word was Jareth, spoken in a voice so weak it was barely a whisper. My mother and I exchanged glances over her hospital bed. "He's not here right now, sweetheart," Mom said gently. "But we are. Your family is here, and we're not going anywhere." Over the next few days, as Maribel grew stronger and more alert, we gradually told her what had happened while she was unconscious. Not everything at once, because the doctors were worried about overwhelming her while she was still recovering from her brain injury, but piece by piece, we helped her understand that the husband she thought she knew was not the man he pretended to be. She took it better than I had expected, with a calm acceptance that was somehow more heartbreaking than tears would have been. "I knew something was wrong," she said after I showed her the video from the yacht. "I could feel it for months, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid." The legal fallout was swift and brutal. Maribel's lawyer, a sharp woman named Kala Hendricks who specialized in high-stakes divorces, tore through Jareth's finances like a hurricane. It turned out he owed money to more people than anyone had realized, and his real estate business was basically a house of cards held together by lies and borrowed time. The yacht belonged to Trina, whose wealthy ex-husband had apparently been funding Jareth's lifestyle without knowing he was paying for another woman's boyfriend. When the truth came out, that arrangement ended immediately, leaving Jareth with nothing but debt and a reputation that made him unemployable in our town. Maribel filed for divorce before she was even discharged from the hospital. She kept the house, the car, and what little remained of their shared assets. Jareth tried to contest it, claiming that she wasn't mentally competent to make major decisions so soon after her brain injury. But when Kala presented the evidence of his affair and financial deception to the judge, along with the timeline showing that Maribel had discovered his betrayal just hours before her accident, the case was decided quickly. The judge awarded Maribel everything she asked for and ordered Jareth to pay her medical expenses and ongoing rehabilitation costs. 6 months later, Maribel was walking again with just a slight limp and had returned to her job as a graphic designer. Her memory had come back completely, including her recollection of that final argument with Jareth on the night of her accident. She told the police what she remembered about their conversation, how he had seemed angry and desperate when she confronted him about Trina, how he had followed her when she left the house to drive to our parents' place. The investigation was reopened, but ultimately there wasn't enough evidence to prove that Jareth had done anything beyond being a terrible husband at a terrible time. But sometimes justice doesn't require a courtroom. Jareth left town after the divorce was finalized, driven away by the social exile that comes with being exposed as a fraud and a cheater in a community where reputation matters. Trina dumped him as soon as his financial situation became clear, apparently having no interest in a relationship that didn't come with yacht parties and expensive dinners. He tried to rebuild his life in a different state, but word travels fast in small professional circles, and his reputation for dishonesty followed him wherever he went. Maribel and I grew closer than we had ever been as adults, bonded by the crisis that could have destroyed our family but ultimately made us stronger. She started dating again after a year, taking things slowly and building relationships based on honesty and trust rather than the facade of perfection that had characterized her marriage to Jareth. She was happier than I had seen her in years, freed from the constant stress of trying to live up to someone else's impossible standards. On the second anniversary of her accident, we went back to the hospital to visit Dr. Oswin and the nurses who had saved her life. Maribel brought flowers and homemade cookies, wanting to thank them for giving her a second chance at life. As we walked through the ICU where she had spent those critical first days, she stopped at the room that had been hers and looked through the window at the current patient, another woman fighting for her life with machines and determination. You know what the strangest part is? Marable said as we stood in the hallway. I'm grateful it happened. Not for the accident itself, but for what it revealed. I could have spent years married to a man who was lying to me about everything, never knowing who he really was. The accident was terrible, but it saved me from something worse. She squeezed my hand, the same hand I had held during all those frightening nights when we didn't know if she would survive. And it showed me who my real family is, the people who stayed by my bed and fought for me even when I couldn't fight for myself. As we left the hospital that day, I thought about how disasters sometimes clear away the things that were never supposed to last anyway, making room for something better to grow in their place. Jareth had tried to use Marable's vulnerability as an opportunity for his own selfish gain, but instead he had revealed his true character to everyone who mattered. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the greatest freedom, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up giving us the biggest gift of all, the chance to start over with the truth.